What drugs have saved the most lives of color? Do we all need to thank white people en masse for these inventions and discoveries? So it's a thought I had as we've been looking around the current social climate in the world, talking about white supremacy is one of the things that is tearing down the world, that has been holding people back. And it has originated from the United States of America, where people focus on its history of slavery, chattel slavery in specific, the Atlantic slave trade in specific, because we're not talking about just slave trade in general, because if you just talk about the slave trade in general, that has been something that has been ongoing throughout human history that still goes on today. When you're talking about East Africa, I'm recording this from Nairobi, Kenya right now. When I look back into the time of my ancestors, I found out that with my ancestors, that was involved in the Arabian slave trade, the Trans-Saharan slave trade. And right now, you look at some places in the Middle East, there are some places that are a lot closer to actual slavery than anything people in the United States of America say. And I'm not talking about just the professional athletes like, yeah, we're like some sort of celebrity slavery and this kind of thing, and that kind of literally means figuratively. But I'm going all the way talking to people who say like, oh, like there's corporate slavery and things like that, or oh, we're enslaved by actually having to sign student debts and going to school and get these degrees. No, that might be more like indentured servitude. There's something in that, but that whole idea is different. But coming back to this shortly, coming back to this thought, this whole thing of holding people accountable in the past for actions that somebody committed in the past, however long in the past, this original sin type of thing, this inherited sin, this inherited guilt type of thing, where oh, this person shared some kind of characteristics with you, and then now you have this, you have to owe this blood debt type of thing. This is something that has been it's something that has been with humanity. I think original sin needs to be just relegated to the trash heap of history. They definitely, for it to have existed for this long, there had to be some advantageous actual things to it, where some things are behavioral. Someone's family might do something to your family, and it's due to the way that family was actually reared and something that they are taught, and there's going to be chances they might repeat this action. So you take caution of them, and then you're aware of this family, and you kind of have that animosity, and you keep that up, and you avoid being re-victimized by these people. Another one is just in the society and the culture, it was just preventatory. It was just like, hey, if you actually do this to this person and it's proved that you find this, you hurt this person's son, they might come back and hurt your son. This eye for an eye type of thing. That, again, is not just in the Bible thing, but that is the thing there. This comes from some kind of collectivist thing, especially when you get now into like races, cultures, traditions, and things like this, and say, white people have done this to black people and are holding black people down. White people have done this to black cultures, black countries, people of color, countries of color, Cox, have done all these things, and they've limited them and things like that. And they focus on the bad. And then people say, we're not going to have the white guilt. We're not going to have this. I'm like, yeah, you shouldn't have that white guilt. I agree. It's okay to be white. It's better not to care. It's okay to be black. It's better not to care. It's okay to be Hispanic, Latino, whatever. It's okay to be any part of these groups that you want to categorize yourself with. But to me, it's better not to care. It's better to be solid in yourself as an individual above any of that. And then when you come to the groups, these things can change around. You can choose to be parts of these groups. Some groups, like for me, depending on how you define it, I just happen to be black. There's nothing I can do to change that. We can get like vitiligo. There might be some future type of things where we're going to get to the point where we actually start changing our genetics, start getting like actual things, going past the whole situation where I think some big cosmetics company in the United States of America is no longer selling skin whitening cream because it's been something that has been detrimental to the black community in the United States of America, that their skin is not allowed. And then you look in Africa and there's a swath of this. But anyway, so coming back to this whole thing, there might be a time where we actually will be transracial. We will be able to start stretching these things. Transhuman. And there's some things about transhumanism that we already are. Part of you getting this information from computers using the internet, that is a transhuman aspect. You've probably taken some vaccines. You probably take some medications. And that's what I'm getting into with this whole idea. If we're saying, white people, for the negative things that some white people did in some countries to some people of color and some people from other countries, is still responsible. The white people today are still responsible for that. Then those few people, because we're talking about hundreds of thousands, right? And then you can say, okay, from this people, they killed all these people. You can even count them. If you actually count them, then you look on the flip side and you just look at certain medications. How many people have been saved? How many lives of color have been saved by certain medications? How many of you go to hospitals today? How many lives of color are currently in hospitals being kept alive from actual things that white people have done? So I just had a general concern. I was like, okay, what drug has actually saved the most people in the world? What's the thing that's actually helped the most people? So you could say like, okay, all these lives were taken from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade, and then you could count and say, okay, this many lives were lost. Would they be able to actually do an equation and see like what was the other side? So anyway, for this, I'm going to go read these two articles from Proclinical, which is the 10 most important drugs, and then from Encyclopedia Britannica, which is the 7 drugs that changed the world. And it is going to be some repetition, but regardless, I think I want to read both of them, and because you're going to have some little different things about each drug, and you might find this enjoyable as well, so let me just get into the reading now. I'm going to start with Encyclopedia Britannica, 7 Drugs That Changed the World. This is by Kara Rogers. And Kara Rogers is a senior editor of biomedical sciences at Encyclopedia Britannica, where she oversees a range of content from medicine and genetics to microorganisms. She joined Britannica in 2006 and ... Not going to get into that. Okay, so first one, how are this going? People have swallowed elixirs, inhaled vapors, and applied ointment in the name of healing for millennia. But only a small number of substances can be said to have fundamentally revolutionized medicine. 7 of those drugs are listed here, along with some facts that may surprise you. Number 7, Polescu's pancrean, or pancrean? Polescu's pancrean. It's Pancrein. I'm going to go with like pancrean because I think it's something to do with the pancreas. And then maybe during that he found the actual thing. There's a little drawing, a little doggy there. Okay, so insulin, discovery of an illustration of Canadian scientist Frederick G. Banting and Charles H. Best in the laboratory testing insulin on a diabetic dog. The discovery of insulin was no doubt a major breakthrough in medicine. Prior to its discovery, diabetes sufferers often died at a young age. But while Canadian scientists Sir Frederick G. Banting and Charles H. Best, along with their colleagues, often are credited with the hormone's discovery and isolation, Romanian physiologist Nicolas C. Paulescu appears to have beaten them to it. Paulescu isolated a substance called pancrein, presumably insulin, in 1916. But he was soon after recruited to serve in World War I. He finally published his findings in 1921, though they were overshadowed by the release of the Canadian's report earlier the following year. So he released it and then the following year? And you see, this is the thing. This is not even that long ago, 1921. It's not even 100 years ago. How many people have been saved with that? And this is something that I was just thinking about in general with current pandemic and current situations. With the current pandemic that the world is going through as I record this, a lot of old people are dying, a lot of people who had pre-existing conditions. In the past, many of those pre-existing conditions would have made those people die a lot earlier. Like, it's just a great time to be in Team Human. We're going to be having lots of changes. We're just thinking about how many lives have been saved just by this in the last 100 years. It's an amazing thing to think of. Think about the amount of technology and information, because even back then, now if you come up with something, you can put that out, put that information out, even if you have to be called to do something else. Maybe not something as destructive as a world war, but something that stops you from going out. You can still publish. You put it online, you publish and get it out there. It's not like this whole 5-year break, because when he found the insulin in 1916, and then it took all the way to 1922, I guess, to have the actual Canadian's report that actually got publicized, how many people could have been saved within that time? Again, discounting the World War that was also taking lives away. So there's different things to consider. I think it's kind of interesting to just think of that. Okay, so number 6, Bayer. Take 2 and call us in the morning. So an early bottle of Bayer aspirin, there's a picture here. In 1899, Fabriken, Farbenfabriken, Vormals Friedrich Bayer and Company, or Bayer and Co., later Bayer AG, introduced aspirin, a pain reliever that would come to rank highly among the world's most commonly used drugs. The company credits the synthesis of pure. Okay, some of these words here. This is ACETYLSALICYLIC. So I think that end is silic, then salicylic, acetylsalicylic, acetylsalicylic acid. Aspirin's active ingredient to Bayer chemist Felix Hoffmann. However, decades after its introduction, former Bayer chemist Arthur Eickergrun cried foul, claiming to have invented the process of the compound synthesis himself, with Hoffmann merely carrying out the procedure. Bayer holds by the claim it was that Hoffmann was the first inventor, or was the inventor. Okay, number 5. Everybody say calm, some little heart kind of things, some triangular type of things. Diazepam or Valium is a benzodiazepine drug that is commonly used to reduce symptoms of anxiety. Probably should have taken maybe I'll put the pictures up. No, I'm not going to put pictures. I'm just going to be reading this. Just going to watch whatever's on the screen. I don't know what I'm going to put on the screen. I don't know. I'm going to put something on the screen. Some kind of speed drawing or something. The introduction of the tranquilizer chlorpromazine, also known as thorazine, in the 1950s represented a turning point in psychiatry, one that gave rise to the psychopharmacological revolution. Indeed, not only was chlorpromazine successful, by 1964 some 50 million people had taken the drug, but its development also laid the groundwork for the later generation of agents used in the treatment of anxiety and depression. Furthermore, the characterization of its effects on neurotransmitters and their receptors provided insight into how impulses are passed from one neuron to the next in the brain, leading to major advances in scientists' understanding of mental illness and cognition. Now, this from a small aside, there's something that I started noticing when I was in high school and middle school in the United States of America was I get the feeling that people were overschooled, but they were overmedicated. A lot of kids in their teens, preteens, were taking some rather heavy drugs. And as you see here, this is 1964, some of these things coming in. And then other things that developed after. We don't know what the actual effect is for the long term. We don't know. There might be generational effect, there might be epigenetic effects, but it just seemed to me that a lot of kids were being drugged for just being kids, for just being rambunctious, for having that energy. And then maybe their parents have the lifestyles where they can't spend that much time at the home. They just go and they read these new newspapers or these new reports that are saying this and this about the kids, or you need to worry, you need to take this medication. And then you have the drug industry, and then you look at what's happening, something like the opioid crisis in the United States of America, and you're like, who's in charge of actually checking to see if these drugs are actually good for people? Oh, the FDA and all these people, oh yeah, they know what they're doing, right? They have their best interests in mind. They're the most actual capable of doing this, but maybe they're not the most capable of doing that. Even if they actually have the best intentions in mind, the system itself might just actually not have it. I mean, that FDA was also the same one who's organizing that food pyramid and demanding what should be in your actual school lunches and things like that. And look how that turned out. So there's some questions with that. So with something like this, yeah, some of these might have helped people, but then some of these have also affected people in different ways, and we might not know the true effects of some of these things. Okay, I mean, we might not know them yet, if we ever will. I think some of them, the things we'll be able to know more of. So number 4, from chemical warfare to cancer. Burkitt lymphoma. Burkitt lymphoma cells. Okay, so nitrogen mustards were developed in the 1920s and 30s as agents of chemical warfare. By the 1940s, however, it had become clear that at least one of these compounds, HN2, also known as mechlorethamine, was better suited for use in the fight against cancer, specifically against human lymphomas, than it was in the fight between Axis and Allied powers. In 1949, mechlorethamine, I just said that and then I'm already not saying it again, mechlorethamine became the first drug approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for the treatment of cancer. And I have a separate video where I actually go in and talk about cancer and things like that, where I'm like, okay, yeah, with the chemotherapy and these UV radiation, because of that line Donald Trump did, some of this stuff is chemo and UV radiation, and unfortunately, it's like we've got to just nuke everything around here and then try to get your healthy cells to come back as we kill the cancerous cells as it goes. And this again, 1949. This is a relatively new thing, and we're getting better and better as we go. So number 3, so retro that it's antiretroviral. Okay. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration's approval in 1987 of zidovudine, more widely known as AZT, was a breakthrough in the treatment of HIV/AIDS. While not able to cure the disease, the drug was found to prolong the lives of AIDS patients. It was the first of the so-called nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors, a group of antiretroviral drugs that became a cornerstone of HIV/AIDS therapy. Owing to these drugs, and perhaps more significantly, to increased access to these drugs in countries worldwide, the annual numbers of deaths from AIDS declined in the early 21st century. So that's a good one. Okay, number 2, population control. This is going to be controversial to some people, but I think control is a positive thing in general. Okay, so there's a picture of birth control pills, so that's what it's going to be. In the early 1920s, Austrian scientist Ludwig Haberland published a paper suggesting that hormones could be used as an effective means of contraception in animals. While it is unclear, he may have soon after tested a hormone preparation in clinical trials, despite heavy criticism from colleagues who considered contraception to be taboo. Haberland's work, however, came to an abrupt end with his suicide in 1932. 2 decades passed before the further clinical trials of hormonal contraception were conducted in humans, and then largely at the urging of social activist Margaret Sanger. The first birth control pill was approved in 1960 in the United States. I think there's a typo there. It might be supposed to be a comma. But Margaret Sanger is also, I've heard her being involved with like Planned Parenthood and establishment of that. And there have been certain quotes and things that she said that have been considered to be rather racist. So it's been questionable about her personality and her intentions. And then you add the fact that in the United States of America, there seems to be a predominantly high or a disproportionately high number of abortions in the black community. But I think in general, being able to plan and have the control over your families, I think that's a positive thing. Now with the hormones, what are the actual changes of these hormones? Just like I mentioned before with taking some of those things, there are certain effects that we might see where we're changing our genetics, but epigenetic changes in different populations and how much is actually in the water, and they say things like this. So there's questions. And speaking of questions, the suicide in 1932 when he's working on something that is questionable, is taboo like this, I feel that if this was current year and it was a mysterious suicide, people would be talking about some kind of Illuminati and he might have been killed for what he was actually doing. People were a lot more devout when it came to Christianity, and even in living memory, in my living memory, there was abortion doctors being threatened and I think killed, and abortion locations actually being bombed. So I can imagine going back then, people were even more gung ho, and they could have been situations where like, we got to kill this guy. This guy is stepping in God's work. Again, that's just a thought. So the last one before we go to the next reading. Number 1, a life-saving contaminant. Sorry. So penicillin notalum, it looks like, from the picture, it looks like some mountains. It looks like some Google Earth type of mountain range, satellite imagery. Okay, so in 1928, Scottish bacteriologist, that doesn't sound right, bacteria, and then bacteriologist, anyway, in 1928, Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming was in the process of sterilizing bacterial culture plates that had become contaminated with mold when he noticed clear zones circling mold colonies. The mold toxin responsible for killing the bacteria turned out to be penicillin, which Australian pathologist Howard Walter Florey and British biochemist Ernest Boris Chain later successfully isolated and purified to produce what became arguably the world's most effective, life saving antibiotic. Incidentally, Fleming seemed to thrive on contamination. His other major discovery of the antiseptic enzyme lysozyme in 1921 was made after he had accidentally contaminated a culture plate with his own cold germs. Okay, so yeah, that's it. How many people? How many times can you think of times in your life that you'd have probably died if you didn't have access to penicillin or any of these other drugs? Let me know what you think. Okay, so just jumping on to the next one. Let's see which ones are included. They said 7 in there. This is from Pro-Clinical. This is by Peter Hogg. Wonder if it's any relation to David Hogg from Florida with that school shooting situation. I'm not quite sure. Okay, there have been many drugs developed throughout history that have been pivotal in assisting the survival of vast populations of humans, curing life-threatening conditions, as well as advancing medical and scientific knowledge. To determine those that they're described as the most important, key factors need to be considered. First, drugs that have been developed for life-threatening conditions are at the top of the list since their very discovery and implementation has often paved the way for further development that has wiped out conditions or lessened their severity. Second, we must consider the scale of the drug's use and the amount of people it has been used to treat. Here we list the top 10 most important drugs developed. Number 10, ether, 1846. Before its first uses, ether had been known for over 300 years. However, nobody had thought to use it as an anesthetic. The development of ether has led the way to more modern and effective drugs. Before ether's discovery, people literally used to have limbs amputated while being held down. The drug works by suppressing people's brain activity to the point that major operations can be carried out without the individual experiencing pain. Over the past few decades, newer and improved anesthetics have also been developed, giving ether a firm place in the list of the most important drugs to be discovered. Hiv Protease Inhibitors in the 1990s. HIV infection was first documented in San Francisco and New York City in 1981. So can we call it the San Francisco 81, the San Fran 81, or San Francisco virus, like the China virus? I don't know. Okay, so HIV infection was first documented in San Francisco and New York City in 1981. 4 years later, it was identified as the causative agent of acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. Although not the first HIV drugs, protease inhibitors, combined with other types of AIDS drugs, meant that for the first time doctors could keep HIV levels so low that patients never developed AIDS. In 2009, around 10 protease inhibitors had reached the market for treating HIV. And this is another thing. Some of these things, you might have heard these things in school, in different classes or different documentaries or things like that. But I think it's an interesting thing to just have an idea of. But with this, there's oftentimes where you get an actual virus, you get actually something, and then the condition that virus gives you is what kills you. And that's the same thing with the pandemic that we're going through right now. The virus itself can spread, and not everybody who actually gets the virus will actually have any negative symptoms. Now, there's a bunch of other things of why. That you can die with the virus, you can die of the virus in some situations. So, was the virus the main thing that got you, or did that weaken you to the point where the other things you had took you down, or did that weaken you to a point where now you didn't have any defense to get something new? I think those are the 3 different categories you can look at with something like this. Okay, number 8. Chemotherapy drugs in the 1900s or the 1990s. 1900s now. Mustard gas was one of the first chemotherapy agents to treat cancer. The same gas used as a weapon in World War I. Mustard gas proved to kill cancer cells. However, it also significantly damaged healthy ones, leading to little survival benefit. The first drug to prove itself against cancer was in fact methotrexate, which in 1956 cured a rare tumor called choriocarcinoma. Over the next few decades, advances in chemotherapy were made, and numerous drugs with different mechanisms of action led to dramatic improvements in patient survival and decline in mortality rates. The increased survival from cancer today is down to both the development of a vast array of chemotherapy agents as well as early detection programs implemented by health systems across the world. And again, the early detection, this is another aside. Unfortunate things with the pandemic is it has stopped certain people from going to hospitals for things that do detect certain things earlier. So there probably will be some knock-on effect of people who might have been able to catch certain conditions earlier that now will catch them months later where it has actually advanced too long. So that's another consideration, which is an unfortunate thing to just think of. Number 7. Chlorpromazine or Thorazine in 1951. Chlorpromazine is the first official antipsychotic drug and was discovered in 1951. Its discovery and use represented a turning point in psychiatry and one that led to what some term as a psychopharmacological revolution. I don't know why I say a word and the next time I say it, just shortly after, I'd say it in a different way. So not only was the drug a huge success, but just over 10 years later, it had been used by around 50 million people. Chlorpromazine is also known to have paved the way for future generations of drugs used to treat anxiety and depression. The mechanics of the drug also enabled researchers to further understand the effects of neurotransmitters in the brain and how impulses pass from one neuron to the next. This discovery was to become pivotal in further advancing our understanding of mental illness. It's almost it's close to what was written in Britannica, but with some of these things, if you're just providing information, the format you provided is the same. It doesn't have to be necessarily plagiarism. But part of this it is what parts of the world, what percent of the world has access to something like this? Will there be an improvement when other places do? I know there's certain cultures that have stigma towards certain mental conditions. They consider it demon possession, or they consider it something wrong with the person's blood. Now, there actually are genetic aspects to these, so that's not completely against it. But there are certain countries, I think mostly the Western countries, where there's more access to some of these things than there are other places. What will happen if it's found to be positive? As I said, there are some questions to actually the effects of these things. If it's found to be positive, what's going to happen? I think there's better ways to actually deal with some of these mental issues that we have coming from adverse childhoods. I'm more for pushing peaceful parenting and having that and avoiding some of these conditions because I think some of the epigenetic changes, some of the imbalances that happen come from that. That is just my general amateur observation. I could be completely off, and maybe these drugs are what we really need to just change our minds, or have a separate video where we talk about psychedelics, who smokes weed and do all these things. I'm not telling you to do this, but some people would say like, yeah, all you gotta do is just take some mushrooms, man, and then the mushrooms will take you to this place, and then you'll just be like one with nature, and everything's just gonna be copacetic with that chloropromazine and thorazine and the DMT and all. So yeah, there's that. Okay, so number 6, polio vaccine. Although vaccines are not technically drugs, they are a form of preventative medicine. Polio, a disease caused by a virus living in the throat and intestinal tract, was once one of the leading causes of disability in the world, and was the source of widespread fear and panic. Since the introduction of the vaccine in 1955, the disease has been eradicated from almost every part of the world. However, since the virus is still in existence, all children are generally still given the vaccine before starting school. Okay, so yeah. What's your thought on vaccines? I'm not quite sure. I guess it's a thing where I took some when I was a kid. Of course, I was given some, and then the flu vaccine, things like that. If you're in the area, depending on what the season is. Now this is a current pandemic. What's your take on taking this supposed vaccine that's going to be made for the actual pandemic virus? Let me know what you think. Aspirin, 1899. This is number 5. Aspirin, as we know it today, came into being in the form of acetylsalicylic. Okay, you see they don't have the cyclic. It's different. Acetylsalicylic acid. When a pharmacist at Bayer used the drug to alleviate his father's rheumatism. It was widely believed at the time of the discovery that aspirin relieved pain by acting on the central nervous system. Today we know its uses extend far beyond simple pain management, and it is even thought to fight inflammation that can be at the cause of heart disease and numerous cancers. Doctors today even advise that everyone over the age of 40 should be taking this wonder drug. For individuals with conditions such as muscle pain, arthritis, or headaches, aspirin is inappropriate because of its side effects. But aspirin is an ideal choice for its analgesic effects. Analgesic. Analgesic. Okay, so they're saying for muscle pains and arthritis and headaches, so you don't take those? Why? I don't know. So number 4, morphine, 1827. Morphine was first discovered by German pharmacist Friedrich Serturner. Okay, I think another reason I thought of this was, of course, you can look at the German, who is actually an Austrian, but that famous German and the things that German did is considered to be part of the negatives in the entire world. He's considered the great Satan of sorts of civilization, of current civilization and things like that. But how many Germans did things like discover morphine that helped people? What does it weigh out for you to be like German culture is more about that Austrian guy, or German culture is more about all these other people that found things like morphine? How does it balance out? And part of why I prefer just being an individualist is you take this out and you don't have to balance it out. That was Friedrich Serturner. That was everybody else who worked with Friedrich was responsible for this, and you say thanks to them, and that's cool. And something about the culture this happened. Let's find the good things in that culture that led this to happen, and let's encourage that. But also, that other Austrian guy was that Austrian guy. There's something about that culture as well that enabled that Austrian guy. Let's find out those things and take them away. And let's prevent those things being actually spread to other cultures as well. It's not just the Germans who are responsible for the negative, nor is it just cheer the Germans for being responsible for the positive. Okay. So morphine was first discovered by German pharmacist Friedrich Serturner. 2 decades later, Merck began its commercial marketization in 1827. The drug soared in usage after the development of the hypodermic syringe in 1852. Although individuals may become addicted to the drug, it is nevertheless agreed that the benefits of the painkiller far outweigh the disadvantages of its use. Without this drug, literally millions of individuals with bodily injuries or more complicated medical conditions would have spent their lives in vast amount of pain. The discovery and use of morphine also led the way to discover a new generation of pain management drugs, some of which can be even purchased over the counter in pharmacies today. So I think that's kind of interesting. I was just talking about the good and the bad and things like that from different cultures. See, there's good and the bad. Morphine is morphine. There's good and the bad things that have come from it, depending on how it's used. The German culture is the German culture. Humans are the humans. You put them in there, it's good and the bad, depending on what aspects of that were actually used. Okay, number 3, smallpox vaccine. Smallpox has been known as one of the worst threats humanity has ever faced. In today's term, it was as deadly as cancer or heart disease, killing well over 10% of the population, with figures being up to 20% in higher populated towns and cities. Thanks to the development of the vaccine in the 19th century, it was one of the first diseases to be wiped off of the planet. Today, the eradication of smallpox is seen as one of humanity's greatest achievements. And that's an interesting thing right now as we're dealing with this new pandemic. Is it something that will be eradicated from humanity? Could it just magically disappear? And not in the sense of mocking Trump for saying it, or not in the sense of, oh, this is just a hoax put up by the media, ginning it up in election season, or it magically disappears when people are protesting social injustice that is positive for the left and the establishment, but then it magically appears again when people want to go back to work. Not in that sense, but just in a thing where some actual things as an organism can come out. Apparently with viruses, part of their evolutionary process, even though it's not a life form, but it just how it selects for itself. If you kill off your host too fast, you will die as well. So the strand that doesn't necessarily kill off the host will be the one that actually duplicates and exists more, so it becomes less damaging. So it comes to these kind of things where what will still be here? What are the certain diseases and things that we have right now that won't be here in 10 years, 20 years, in 100 years? Or what are the new things that are also going to all of a sudden going to be there? And yeah, so that's just something to think of there. Okay. Number 2, insulin. 1922. Individuals with advanced diabetes are unable to produce sufficient amounts of insulin, a hormone involved in the conversion of sugar to energy. Before the advent of insulin in 1922, Patients were given a near-starvation diet to ward off symptoms. Insulin is also understood to have paved the way for future hormone replacement therapies and has also saved the lives of countless patients diagnosed with diabetes. Now, diabetes is an interesting condition. It might be due to human success, like the access to sugars that we have. Because in the past, was this really that big of an issue? Is it that big of an issue in certain cultures and communities and areas that don't have the westernized diet with its abundant access to carbohydrates and sugars and things like that? So that could be something to see. And then when the diets change in the future, are we going to have now giving birth to bodies and that have had epigenetic changes or that select for better ways to actually deal with this different change of diet, with these excess of carbohydrates? I mean, excess in comparison to our evolutionary environment. So these things are relative and subjective. Is the human being, even without just transhumanism, and you see the transhumanism is already there because we're using machines to farm. That's how we can produce this excess of actual carbohydrates. And then when you have that excess of carbohydrates, you can get those actual nutrients. And then when you don't need to actually be out and about working out as much using your physical self and you're burning those calories and burning that energy down and you're sitting and you're actually being able to be more productive using those same computers again, that's going to change your actual energy expenditure versus the actual nutrients that you're taking in. So that relationship of being transhuman is already there. But I'm talking about just purely on the genetic level. Like if you just had that with the changes, what kind of human would change after a while evolving to the different access to resources that you actually have? That could be something interesting. This sci-fi is like going to this. Sci-fi is my favorite field of books to read. I think everything comes from sci-fi, really. Okay, number one, penicillin in 1942, and this is the last one of the reading. Penicillin was first developed in 1928, but started it to be used in 1942. As the first official antibiotic, it marked a turning point in human history and led the way to the treatment of numerous bacterial diseases. It has been calculated that the antibiotic has saved over 80 million lives, and without its discovery and implementation, 75% of the people today would not be alive because their ancestors would have succumbed to infection. It has been used to treat a plethora of conditions such as pneumonia and scarlet fever, as well as ear, skin, and throat infections. In 2010, over 7.3 billion units of penicillin were administered worldwide. However, inappropriate use of the drug has meant that the world is now facing antibiotic resistance, and bacteria are evolving to fight off the drug's effect. And before I finish here, I want to repeat that. That is one thing that I'm scared, a bit fearful of, is when I first heard this, because someone takes a drug, someone's like, okay, you have this bacterial infection, and as I mentioned before, even with viruses, they have some kind of evolution, but with bacteria, which is an actual life form, it's actually more advanced in actually doing it. So it will control. It's like, oh, this sort of thing is going to kill me. I'm going to make a stronger version of myself and reproduce to be able to maintain this. So you have a situation where you take this, and then the bacteria in you, let's say you have 100 units of bacteria, and the doctor says, okay, if you take these drugs for the full actual prescribed time, you'll kill 100% of that one. Like we think in 10 days, you'd have killed it all. But here are pills for 5 more days to make sure to wipe it out. Someone will start taking the drug, and after 7 days, all the symptoms will go, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I kind of feel okay." Like, and technically, their body would have killed off most of the actual drug, most of the weak version of that bacteria. But there will be some bacteria that actually was strong enough and might learn what that penicillin can do. Sorry, what that penicillin can do, what that antibacterial can do, and it's the stronger version. It might not be strong enough to actually reproduce in that person's body and take them over and make them ill, but it was strong enough to reproduce and not be killed by that. And then it might spread to somebody else, and that spread would have been a selecting of a stronger version of that organism, of that bacteria. So that is something that I implore you, if you do have some kind of antibacterial situation, if you do have some kind of prescription, please see the whole prescription through. Just for the basic information that I know about this, and again, could be wrong, but from the basic information that I know about this, that could be a huge solid that you just do for Team Human in general. Finish the actual prescription. See it through. Just because you feel better doesn't mean it has completely eradicated the thing. And I guess that's also something to consider with the whole current pandemic and things like that. Okay, so and to finish off, say, what do you think of a top 10 list? Are there any drugs that you think should get any mention? And I'll ask you that as well. That's what they asked here. Do you think there's other things? And then this is ProClinical is a consulting and staffing service provider targeted towards pharmaceutical industry. So anyway, so what do you think of the pharmaceutical industry? What do you think of some of these things? What do you think of this contention here that 80 million lives were saved directly, and then from that you've had an explosion in human population? Is it more towards things like this? Is it more towards industry? Is it more towards actual farming? And all these things, but all these things are tied together. The human organism, human civilizations, human culture, all these things are tied together. And that's part of why I'm saying this whole thing of just saying, oh, white people did this to one sector of these other people in this place and affected this, and now it has this long-lasting effect. There are isolated relationships, but when it comes down to it, it's different individuals. When you start looking at collectives, where do you stop that collective? Where do you stop that grouping? Because there are certain things. Unfortunately, Atlantic slave trade happened. But there are certain things where through that Atlantic slave trade, somebody was moved from Africa to the United States of America, the current United States of America, that maybe has given birth to the person in the United States of America that will actually be able to find out how to end cancer, how to just completely fight cancer off, to just immunize every human being born from then on, to not be able to actually get cancer. Would that be worth that ancestor being enslaved? I don't know. I can't answer that question. But I think you can try to deal with people on the individual basis and deal with collectives as a current collective and realize you can't just shift the blame or carry over the pride or be owed certain things, because I don't owe you for something your ancestor did. You don't owe me for something my ancestors suffered. Okay? So that's it for now. This is part of my shorty series, but I think I'm going to have this in the actual read series. I don't know where I'm going to put this. Probably just put it in the rants. But anything, like, share, subscribe. I appreciate you taking your time to come listen. Let me know what you thought about these lists. Did you know about these things before? Or was this more just like kind of a refresher of things that you had learned before? Or are you just in general aware of some of these things? Or are you in the medical field and like, yeah, this is things that I know. So that's it for now. Goodbye.